Good morning. The mystical way, action and contemplation. I first learned about mysticism in high school. My spiritual director recommended it to me. Every religion, he told me, has it. Judaism has the Kabbalah. Christianity has St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, the cloud of unknowing. Islam has the whirling dervishes. Hinduism has yoga. Buddhism, there is the Zen sect. Taoism has the Tao Te Ching. Each of these traditions is unique, different from all the others, and yet they all have a mystical way. By mysticism, I mean the interplay between action and contemplation. What my spiritual director didn't tell me is that in every creedal religion, while those who govern encourage action, especially those that they prescribe, they consider contemplation as secondary, begrudgingly acknowledged, but by and large ignored. The reason for this is that these religious elites ground their authority in their claim to a unique ability to pontificate on the nature of the unknowable. Contrariwise, to contemplate is to ignore creed. Since ultimate reality is unknowable, creed is irrelevant, and even a distraction indirectly and personally experiencing it. This irrelevance of intermediaries has often been a threat to the powers that be in religious institutions. St. Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake. St. John of the Cross was imprisoned by the members of his own order. The sixth Zen patriarch, Hui Neng, had to flee by night to avoid the wrath of jealous senior disciples. Even in the secular realm, at least in our day and society, there's a premium on action. Contemplation is seen as inferior to action. Type A personalities are, by that very designation, put ahead of other people. Type A's act. The Nike motto, "Just do it," has become a societal mantra. The appeal of this motto might lie in its encouragement to confidence, so as to be able to act, and yet it is incomplete. It fails to ask the prior question, do what? The assumption is that there is a clear thing to do and a clear way to do it. If you're standing in the middle of the woods and you want to get out, but don't know which way to go, do you just start walking? Or do you consult your map to first determine where you are? Just walking is more efficient. It gets you somewhere, but it isn't guaranteed to be effective. You may end up walking deeper into the woods. We all have a map, our view of the world. We all act out of this personal worldview. But every worldview is necessarily incomplete. We are all ultimately blind men grasping at the elephant. We can assume that reality, like the elephant, is there, but even so, we are all limited in our grasp of it, being able to touch only part of it. And while it may be enough for us to assume that the elephant is a tree or a snake or a wall, what should we do when the reality that we touch no longer matches our view of it? When that happens, we need to stop, to realign our worldview to the reality that we experience. Only in that way can we hope to know in what direction to go to just do it. The crucial point is that there's a difference between reality and our view of it. The map is not the woods. As soon as we produce our map, it is out of date. As soon as we articulate our worldview, the world is different from what we described. It has already moved on. There is an irony here. The mystical is often seen as impractical, otherworldly, out of touch with reality. And yet the exact opposite is true. Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. To experience reality is to have our eyes open. Reality, though, like the elephant, is huge, bigger than any of us could ever grasp. The best that we can manage is to take away an impression of that part that we experience and work from that necessarily incomplete impression. The irony is that in order to act in the world and not be overwhelmed by all its details, we have to work from our worldview. We have to live with eyes closed. Mysticism is not theology. Theology is a process of modeling, allowing people within a faith tradition to talk about their beliefs. In contrast, mysticism talks only to encourage people to experience, to enter into the way. The focus of mysticism is the experience that grounds the faith tradition. Theology is the attempt to encompass the significant elements of a faith, but mysticism is the immediate experience of it. Thus, all attempts to explain a mystical experience necessarily fall short. However close they may come, words will always fail, which doesn't mean that people don't try. All the mystical traditions are full of practical advice on how to arrive at the mystical union, to follow the Tao, to achieve Satori. Much of this advice is negative. For example, in The Cloud of Unknowing, the author observes that the union with God is not an experience, since an experience entails a subject and an object, whereas in the mystical union, there is neither, but only the experience. In the Tao Te Ching, the author writes that the way that can be named is not the way. In Zen, there's an anecdote about a master cutting off his disciple's finger, when he tried to repeat his master's enlightenment event. From this, we infer that any particular method to enlightenment is not repeatable. Some advice is even contradictory. A disciple once asked the Buddha if the dog has Buddha nature, and the Buddha replied, yes. Sometime later, the same disciple happened to ask the same question, but this time the Buddha replied, no. In each case, the Buddha did not give his disciple the answer, but rather the answer that the disciple needed at that moment in order for him to progress towards his own answer. It is through contemplation that we realign our worldview to the world. Contemplation isn't inaction, as if we stood the Nike motto on its head and declared, just don't do it. Contemplation is rather a different thing to do, a legitimate activity in its own right. To use a mathematical analogy, if actions are vectors, namely a certain degree of effort expended towards a specific end, then contemplation is the zero vector, with no effort, and the potential of going in any direction. For it is only when we stop acting that we are able to change direction. There are similarities between the mystical way and the scientific method. The method begins with data, which scientists attempt to explain in theories, which are not necessarily consistent with existing theories. These new theories suggest other data that have not yet been observed. The new theory is then tested by devising experiments to see whether this new data will be observed. If it isn't, then the scientific method asserts the new theory is wrong. This assertion, though, does not substantiate the existing theories. On the other hand, if the predicted outcome of the experiment is observed, the method only tells us that the new theory is only plausible, since other, as yet unconsidered theories may also predict the same data. Similarly, the mystic does not enter the mystical way via her creed, but rather by being faithful to her experience, which may well contradict her creed. And while her explanation of her experience might also resonate with others, each person has her own experience, not all of which is covered by any particular explanation. In mysticism, failure to realize predicted outcomes disproves the would-be mystic, but its success can at most corroborate the beliefs of the convinced mystic. So, for example, we can say that the Jonestown Massacre proves that at best Jim Jones was a deluded mystic. But the purported miracles of St. Francis of Assisi only corroborate Christianity, since other religions with mutually exclusive theologies claim their own miracles. What is of primacy is not any given explanation, but rather, for each person, her own experience. Just as the scientific method gives primacy to data over theory, so the mystical way gives primacy to experience over explanation. Both action and contemplation are good in themselves and to be desired. Effective action gives the satisfaction of accomplishment. Effective contemplation gives serenity and a sense of connectedness. But no one can remain either indefinitely. Each must flow into the other. And by whether or not they do flow can we judge the authenticity of any particular mystical way. Action and contemplation are complementary opposites. Action is talking. Contemplation is listening. Action is changing. Contemplation is allowing the change. People of action may resist or even reject contemplation as a waste of the precious time in which to act. St. Francis de Sales advised all priests to spend an hour each day before the Blessed Sacrament, and busy priests to spend 2 hours. Without contemplation, action is ineffective. If nothing else, if people don't take the time to rejuvenate, they will burn out. Then they will become incapable of any action. Conversely, true contemplation must result in action. Contemplation is not a final resting place. If one stays too long in the strawberry fields, one risks losing touch with the very reality that one entered the fields to find. Contemplation is not bad action. What makes any action bad is lack of attention. On their journey, Jesus entered a village where a woman named Martha welcomed him to her home. She had a sister named Mary, who seated herself at the Lord's feet and listened to his words. Martha, who was busy with all the details of hospitality, came to him and said, "Lord, are you not concerned that my sister has left me to do the household tasks all alone? Tell her to help me." The Lord in reply said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and upset about many things. One thing only is required. Mary has chosen the better portion, and she shall not be deprived of it." Jesus reproached Martha not for her action, but for her worry. Let me elaborate on this point with a parable attributed to the Buddha. One day, a man went for a walk in the jungle. He was anxious about what he had yet to do that day and regretful over what he had left undone the day before. Being thus lost in thought, he failed to see that he had wandered off the path. Abruptly, he became apprised of this fact when he came face to face with a tiger, a hungry tiger. No sooner had the tiger roared in appreciation over this unexpected meal than the man spun around and was running for his life. Being thus lost in thought, the running man failed to notice that he was heading towards a cliff. He noticed this fact when he ran right off of it. As he fell, he flung out his arms in desperation, catching hold of a vine that happened to be growing out of the side of the cliff. It was just strong enough to support his weight. Looking up, he saw the tiger that had pursued him, growling down at him. And looking down, he saw a second tiger growling up at him. Thus suspended between the two tigers, he noticed a small mouse nibbling at the root of the vine from which he hung. Beside the mouse, there was a strawberry plant, and on it was a strawberry. Oh, how red it looked. He plucked it and smelled it. Oh, how sweet it smelled. He ate it. Oh, how juicy it tasted. The tiger above is regret, and the tiger below is anxiety. The vine is our life, and the mouse is the troubles that gnaw at us, eventually ending our life. The strawberry is the present moment. Worry turns our attention to the future. Regret makes us focus on the past. Our present troubles tempt us to close our eyes in bitterness. The first two are the tigers that devour our attempts to contemplate. Focusing on the gnawing of the mouse keeps us from even trying. Were we to attend to any of these distractions, we might not even have seen the strawberry. Being in the moment is seeing what is right in front of our eyes, listening to what is actually being said, attending to what is actually happening. And to do that, we need to lay aside all worry and regret, all bitterness over circumstances we can't control, all preconditions and preconceptions. To be in the moment is to be open to being surprised. But being in the moment is the middle stage of contemplation. Before we can be in the moment, we need to stop and prepare ourselves for it. And when in the moment, again, we need to know when to stop so as to do what needs doing. Now a story to illustrate what it means to stop and prepare for contemplation. Alfred, a professor of religious studies, had arranged to meet with Yoshi, the abbot of a Zen monastery. Alfred had wanted to share his understanding of Zen. The abbot had gladly agreed to meet him for tea, always happy to assist anyone seeking enlightenment. So when Alfred arrived, Yoshi was there to personally greet him. No sooner had they both finished bowing than Alfred launched into his lecture. Yoshi listened with interest as they walked up to the monastery. When they arrived at the abbot's office, Alfred was discussing the merits of using koans as a means of attaining satori. Yoshi listened politely as he waited for the professor to ask him a question, which after all he thought was his reason for coming. After a while, the abbot interrupted Alfred to declare that he must prepare the tea. "Oh yes," the professor replied without missing a beat. And as Alfred kept pacing back and forth, Both physically in the room and intellectually in his arguments, Yoshi filled the tea ball, placed it in the pot, prepared the hibachi, lit it, filled the pot with water, and placed it on the hibachi. The pot came to a boil as Alfred was musing on the effort required to sustain one's practice after becoming enlightened. As he did so, Yoshi took the pot off the hibachi and poured the boiling water into the pot. As the tea steeped, so did Alfred's discourse, but still without any questions. When the tea was ready, Yoshi poured it. He let it spill over the rim of Alfred's cup. Yet still Alfred kept talking, oblivious to the flow of the tea, which spilled onto the table, across it, and finally right onto his lap. The scalding tea abruptly ended Alfred's lecture, and he asked Yoshi, "Why do you keep pouring tea when you can see that my cup is full?" And the abbot replied, "Why do you come asking for my tea when your cup is full?" In this first transition stage from action into contemplation, we consciously acknowledge that we do not know, that our actions have hit a wall, that our worldview is incomplete, that the drink in our cup no longer quenches our thirst. In this stage, we are willing to empty our cup in order to have it filled with a better drink. And our cup must be empty. For no matter how superior a vintage of wine we might pour into it, unless our cup is empty, even the best vintage will be diluted by what we currently have in it. Rather than waiting for such a crisis to force us to stop acting, we could set time aside to regularly contemplate, to routinely disentangle ourselves from our worldview and open our eyes to see what it is right in front of them. But even those who do have a regimen of contemplation are still liable to fall into the trap of not knowing when to stop and to begin acting. As the Beatles put it, it's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me. To those who don't know when to leave the strawberry fields, eventually, nothing really matters. Such was the case with a certain devout man who regularly contemplated, but did not recognize the answer to his prayers. He was in the habit of praying every day between the hours of 2 and 3 p.m. At 2 p.m. each day, he would put a sign up on his door which read, "I am at prayer and will not answer until 3 p.m., so please do not bother knocking." Each day the man strove with all his heart to be at one with God. He would beseech the Creator with such words as these, "O Great One, pity me who wish to know you in your true essence. Oh, come to me, show me your face." At such times, great peace would come over him. One day at 2:15, after he had made his usual entreaties to God, there was a knock at the door. Knowing that he had put up his sign, he ignored the knocking and concentrated with renewed fervor in pleading God to reveal himself. Strangely, the knocking increased with equal fervor. Finally, he could stand it no longer and went to the door, and there stood a beggar who stretched out his palm and said, "Alms for the poor?" The man was dumbfounded. He roared at the beggar as he pointed at the sign, "Can't you read?" The beggar looked at the sign and then at the man, and then confessed that no, he could not read. He was just a simple beggar. And then he smiled at him, stuck out his hand again, and asked, "Alms for the poor?" Exasperated, the devout man read the beggar his sign and told him to abide by it. Sadly, the beggar withdrew his hand, turned, and left. With this interruption happily over, the man returned to his prayer, But to his frustration, where before the interruption he had experienced peace, joy, and the exhilaration of anticipation, he now felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so it was the next day. And for each day thereafter, all he felt was emptiness. Finally, unable to bear this desolation, he asked God why he had abandoned him. And God answered him, "It isn't I who have abandoned you. You asked to see my face, and so I came to your door. It is you who sent me away, so I left as you demanded." Being in the moment is like turning your gaze to the sun. We would go blind were we to stare too long into it. But being invigorated by the sun's warmth, we can turn from it to those things that it illuminates, to do what we now see need doing. And so, without regret or anxiety, we can act with confidence until we again hit a wall, be it of fatigue, of having fallen through a hole in our worldview, or simply because it is the time that we have set aside to contemplate. At such a time, we stop to look and listen, and so realign our worldview with the reality that we experience. As for our actions, they don't spring out of nowhere. Actions proceed by a conduit, which springs from the heart, leads through thoughts, which express themselves in words before they finally become actions. All actions follow this course. If we want them to be effective, we have to start upstream at the source, at the heart. In the heart, there are both desires and attachments. Desires define who we really are, but these can be confused with attachments, which only enslave us. The trick is to know the difference, to distinguish between our desires, which, if we cultivate them, will actualize who we are, and our attachments, which enslave us to behaviors we regret but can't seem to avoid doing. Only when we are grounded in our desires and free of our attachments can we trust our thoughts. Until then, we will keep thinking up excuses to fool ourselves into gratifying our attachments. Only when our thoughts are clear of such excuses will our words become coherent. And when they are coherent, those with whom we wish to act will see their consistency. And finally, with clear communication, our actions become authentic and so effective. Contemplation helps us ferret out our attachments and distinguish them from our desires. As it says in the Tao Te Ching, let muddy waters stand for a time and the mud will sink to the bottom. The two sisters of the gospel, Mary and Martha, have respectively been associated with action and contemplation. But these two had a brother named Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. Lazarus is suffering. Both action and contemplation are incomplete without suffering. And suffering is the one reality that none of us has ever or will ever be able to avoid. It is in embracing the suffering that we cannot avoid that we do our own particular contemplation. And in confronting the suffering that we can, that we find our unique action. Thank you. Far be it from me to speak and run away. I welcome any comments or questions you might have. Yes.
Put your hand up.
There's just so much in it that, you know, I don't have any questions. I feel like I have a lot to think about, so thank you.
Maybe to that point,
Hello?
oh, yes, there's a comment or question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you start.
Hey,
Start, Pete.
can you hear me?
Peter, you're on. Go ahead.
Are you speaking to me?
Yes.
Okay. You remind me, hello, in your talk that everything is moving in existence that we consider, and you were speaking simply for human beings when you're talking about the miracle of life. And I think that everything that you were discussing in all the different religions are showing the speculation of looking for an answer for the wonderment that we are the interpretation of life for the entire living aspects that we recognize.
Okay, if I understood you correctly, I think you're trying to expand the whole concept of living to more than just humans. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Not only that, but the miracle, the mystery of life leads to speculation, and we are doing that as human beings when we recognize all the different aspects and ways of living that exist in the world.
Yes, I definitely agree. There are many ways of being, many ways of living. And I think it's a Unitarian Universalist principle that none of them are wrong and that there's good in all of them. And I think that's a positive side to the parable of the blind man and the elephant. All of them were right, but with the proviso that all of them were wrong. I'd like to extend that too. We have 3 cats, one of them died, and the passing of one of our cats was very emotional for us. We had a dog before, we have a turtle. So life is not just human, life is quite a spectrum.